So now that we have everything in our game running, let's create a class that'll help manage the actual game state itself. Inside of our scripts folder, let's create a new script, and we're going to call this Game Manager. Then, in our scene, we're going to create an empty game object. Here, we'll call this Game Manager, and then we're also going to give it a label. Then, before we actually start editing the code in the Game Manager, let's drag the Game Manager script over to the Game Manager object. Here you'll see it's been attached, and we can open this up inside of MonoDevelop. Now, we're going to need two things for our Game Manager to get started. First, we're going to want to reposition the floor towards the bottom of the screen, no matter what the resolution is. And second, we're going to want a reference to the spawner so that we can turn it off when the game first begins. Here we'll create a public property called GameObject, and we're going to call this floor. Next, we'll create a new public property typed to a spawner, and we'll call it spawner. Now, let's create an awake method, and inside of the awake method, we're going to connect up the floor and spawner. But before we do that, let's save our script and go over into Unity. When Unity refreshes, you'll see that the floor and spawner properties are now showing up inside of the inspector. Now we could drag the foreground over to the floor, and we can drag the spawner over to the spawner properties and do this by hand. But we're going to take advantage of a static method called find on the GameObject class itself to do this via code. Let's switch back over to MonoDevelop and set up the floor. Here, we'll call the GameObject class's find method, and we'll pass in the word foreground. Next, we'll do the same thing for the spawner. Even though the spawner is nested inside of the foreground, we'll still be able to find it no matter where it is inside of the scene. Now, before we move on, you'll notice that our spawner property is typed to the spawner class. We're going to want to get a reference to the spawner script itself before we actually close out this line of code. So let's just call getComponent and look for the reference of the spawner. Here you'll see, since find returns the game object, we can also call getComponent within the same line. Let's save our script and go back into Unity. Now, when we run our game, we'll see that the Game Manager automatically gets an instance of the foreground and the spawner script attached to the spawner game object. Let's stop this, go back into MonoDevelop, and add the rest of the code we need to realign the floor. In our start method, we're going to want to get the height of the floor game object. Here we'll set up a variable called floor height, and let's set it to the transform local scale Y position of the floor. Next, we're going to want to create a position vector that we can manipulate once we calculate where the floor needs to go on the screen. Here we'll create a position, and we'll use the floor's current transform position for its value. Now, we'll want to make sure that the floor is always centered, so we'll set its position X value to 0. And for its Y position, we're going to want to calculate where the bottom of the screen is, and in this case, we're going to need to take the full height of the screen and divide that by 2. Remember, the 0 position of the screen always starts in the center in Unity. And then once we figure out the height from the center of the screen to the bottom, we'll then offset that by the height of the floor. In this case, we're actually going to use half of the height of the floor so that it's centered along the bottom of the screen. To get started, let's do position Y equals, we want to make sure that we're using a negative value here. And inside, we're going to want to start with the screen height. We're going to divide this by the pixel perfect camera's pixel to units ratio, which is what we calculated in the awake script of our camera. Then we'll divide this in half, and this will be our first calculation. This is going to get us to the bottom of the screen from the center point. Next, we'll add half of the floor's height to move the floor back up and center it along the bottom of the screen. Here, we'll take floor height, divide it by 2, and clean this up. Finally, we'll need to set this position to the floor's current transform position. So let's type out our floor transform position, and we'll set this to the position we just calculated. And finally, while we're in here, Let's deactivate the spawner by getting a reference to the spawner and setting active to false. Now, if we go back into our game and run the game, now we'll notice that the floor is at the bottom of the camera, and if we look at our spawner, we'll see that it's no longer active. Next, we're going to set up a way to restart our game and respawn our player after he dies.